Koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Welcome into the Hoon on a very special day, for me at least, Budget Day, the first budget for the new government. And welcome into co-host Peter Bale from... Where
Oslo
are you today, Peter?
Oslo today, Bertus. Oslo, and it's lovely. It's lovely to see you. I imagine you. I see they've moved the lockdown to Waiheke, or did you just move your? Have you got a sort of Zoom background that actually shows you at Waiheke when they have the budget lockdown?
That's right. No, this is Waiheke in the background. I've managed to find, Lynn has bought a special birthday present for me, which is the kaka sign. You can see in the background there.
Yes.
And we've got ourselves set up a little bit better now. I don't know if you heard the dawn chorus this morning and yesterday morning via the kaka, but as I started the chorus, 8 kaka went over me, squawking and making a hell of a racket.
Brilliant. Did you manage to get the recording?
I did. It's the most wonderful thing.
I imagine kaka are very, very hard to tame. Which is another metaphor for the show. Of course.
Exactly. We are loud, we are raucous, we're a pain in the ass, we rip the shred of the bark off the tree, and then occasionally we make some lovely bird
and pull the
sounds.
plaster off as well, quite sharply. Yeah,
exactly.
Any other cliches you want?
No. We used to be quite rare, but now we're coming back. And we like to circle around the Parliament, having flown over the hill from Zealandia.
Well, yesterday I was walking down the road to the centre of Oslo, which is a very pretty city. And I think possibly when I was here last year and we did the Hoon, I might have said that it often reminds me about what Wellington could be.
Ooh.
And because it has a beautiful field, as does Wellington, of course, a gorgeous field. And I kept thinking, because I was thinking about the budget, and I was thinking, I wonder what would have happened if Bill Rowling's pension superannuation thing had become a sovereign wealth fund, which it could have, which was the idea. I know we have the super fund, but that started probably 30 years too late. And I guess also now that we're going to go back to drilling under Shane, we can hope for a huge windfall of decades of tax and revenue from oil. Brilliant.
Well, actually, I did have a look in the budget documents for that windfall gains from oil and minerals, because the idea is we dig up a whole bunch of special minerals that are used in electric cars and things. Well, actually, there's no forecast increase from the Treasury. Now, that means we could be exporting a lot, but there's no royalty payments to the government. But I don't suspect that anything has changed with the royalty percentages. So essentially, the Treasury doesn't believe it, and
because the only one we know about related to minerals, isn't it, is the offshore seabed mining in Taranaki. Is it known that New Zealand has rare earths and so on?
Well, there are some rare earths. There's certainly some iron oxide type stuff that you can use to make steel. However, one of the big problems there is that chunk of the seabed in which you'd rip up the top 10 metres or so to get the good stuff.
Well, nobody ever sees it. No one goes to the bloody seabed, do they?
Well, actually, that exact part of the Taranaki Bight is the part that the offshore wind company wants to use. And they've come out very strongly and said, we can't do offshore wind if you keep digging up the bits that we want to put our platforms down on. Apart from anything else, we need to put our platforms on that stuff that you're digging up. Secondly, we'll have a bunch of wires going back to the mainland. And if you keep going over the top of them with a big dredge, that's not good. So it's a classic case of an extractive economy, which is all about digging things up, selling it off, basic commodity style, no value add, trumps anything that might actually create an asset that builds
And
revenue and power that is not going to generate more carbon emissions.
and Bernard, where are the rare earths in New Zealand? Are they on Waiheke? I mean, they're
Hopefully
pretty
not.
hard to find as a percentage of what they dig up. It's there's a reason
Yeah.
they call them rare.
Yeah, and most of those rare earths have been locked up by China. In China, Russia has a bunch. Canada has plenty as well. But you need lots of space to dig stuff up. And also, interestingly, the Chinese are getting very efficient at recycling a lot of this material. They're now at the point where their material in batteries and electric cars are over 90% recyclable. So there are some, pretty serious environmentalists who say we shouldn't worry so much about the issue of rare earths for electrification. Now, you can worry about it for all sorts of other things in military technology, but for electrification, there is a good recycling opportunity there. It is quite a thing. We're going to be talking with Catherine Dyer about that today, what's happening with the climate. I don't know if you saw the temperature in Delhi in the last couple of
I
days.
didn't, but it's also there's record temperatures in Oslo.
Oh, really? Oh, we'll
Yeah,
find
yeah,
out from our
which I
climate
which I
correspondent in Oslo.
suspect is connected to the Atlantic North Atlantic anomalies that Catherine wrote about this week, and that we have really led to this extraordinary sort of bubble over the North Atlantic. And just on electric cars, I was just quite struck. As you walk around Norway, or certainly Oslo, 82% of car registrations last year were electric. And as you know, they've subsidized it. But what's also interesting to me is that there are a range of Chinese brands that I've never seen anywhere else, including sort of absolutely enormous electric limousines and electric vans and sort of really super stylish, very radically designed Chinese cars that we just haven't seen in other markets as yet. And of course, it's a very good indication of why people are absolutely terrified of them, because of them. The car industry is terrified of them because they can be really imaginative with them because they're not sitting on a traditional internal combustion engine platform.
That's right. And they've built these factories and are at the point now where they could be exporting upwards of 20 million electric cars a year. And actually, I haven't written this yet, but I think it is a really interesting strategic and cost of living opportunity for New Zealand. As China is ramping up exports of electric vehicles and solar panels, and as the United States is suddenly trying to restrict that flow into the United States and to preserve its own manufacturing capacity, in part so that it can be ready to turn it to military production in the event of a war with China. Same with Europe, very wary of the Chinese imports. The Chinese are going to export them somewhere. And we've already seen significant price reductions inside China for these. Big announcement in the last week or two of a hybrid plug-in vehicle for less than 15,000 US dollars that can go 2,000 kilometers. And I think New Zealand, who will never have a hope of building electric vehicles and solar panels at the scale of either Europe, the United States, or China, should fill its boots before the shutters come down.
As opposed to buying more second-hand Japanese cars. Bernard, somebody's complaining to me from New Zealand that we're not talking about the budget yet, and
It's coming.
I'm hesitating to tell her to bugger off while I'm busy doing the Hoon.
All right. The budget's coming.
But you've already done a section with Ganesh, and you will be, after we've done the environment, as it were, with Catherine, we're going to lead into Max Rashbrook, or is it? Oh no, Craig Rennie.
Craig Rennie
and
first,
then Max
and
Rashbrook.
then Max Rashbrook. And then we'll be talking to Chris Clodell from Community Housing Aotearoa about the big action in social housing, Kaingaroa,
Yeah,
that sort
and
of thing.
I'll finish off maybe with a little bit about international affairs, the scandal of Israel spying on and threatening the International Criminal Court, and what's just happened, which is that Israel has moved into the border of Gaza and Egypt to create a buffer zone, which will allow the attack on Rafah to continue or to become much more substantial. So we'll be wondering where Joe Biden's red lines are, or what they are now.
Yes. And unfortunately, we don't have Robert with us this week. He's off.
I'm absolutely appalled that he would dare do something else than the Hoon at 5 o'clock on a Thursday night.
he has a book that he is promoting, which is a big deal, and we'll be putting a link in the descriptions to that.
Good, good.
Catherine, welcome into the Hoon. It's lovely to see you on a big week for everything, but in particular, parts of the planet are seeing enormous, pretty shocking numbers. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's been there's just been so much going on in the last couple of weeks, probably as a result of all of the extra heat that's gone into the system over the past year, into the Earth system. But just today there was news that Delhi in India has got to nearly 53 degrees, like 52.9 was their high, which just sounds unbearable. Like I don't, it's yeah. So they were, even over the past week, it's been hot for the last week there. They've been setting up special units in their hospitals to deal with people coming in with heat stroke and other heat-related illnesses, which is obviously very high there at the moment. We also had the floods in Brazil, more than 500,000 people displaced from their homes because of that. There's a heat wave in Mexico, and in fact in the state of Tabasco they were talking about howler monkeys just dropping out of trees dead from heat stroke and dehydration. 26 people have died as well there, and Mexico City, much like Delhi, has a water crisis now. They don't have enough water, and they're looking at potentially running out sometime towards the end of June completely, which is obviously quite critical. Then we've had all of those what they're referring to as kitty cat storms in the US. So
tell me about this. Why are they called kitty cat storms? They look pretty severe to me.
These are the tornadoes and the sudden big thunderstorms that are happening through the sort of the mid plains. But so historically they call the big hurricanes that affect several states, they call, are often referred to as NatCat or national catastrophes. And so these storms, which are much smaller and more fleeting, are referred to now as kitty cats. But the insurance industry is basically saying that the sheer scale and number of these and the amount of damage that they're doing has added up to more than, say, a single NatCat. So it's becoming quite significant and starting to affect things like insurance premiums and that part of US, in addition to the way the hurricanes affect Florida and Louisiana and fires affect California. Now you've got the whole middle section that's been affected by these kitty cat storms, and also they're moving. The climate change is not so much increasing the intensity of them, but it's shifting where they're happening and elongating the amount of time the number of days that they occur for. So. Yeah,
and it's interesting to see now significant parts of the United States are uninsurable. Some of the large companies have pulled out. It's very difficult now in Florida and in California to get any sort of storm or fire protection. In fact, an article out of the Washington Post last night showing the number of households, or the percentage of households that are now uninsured completely, is up to 12% from 5% a few years ago.
And this is, for most people, their single biggest asset, right? So they stand to lose everything. And they're also saying that insurance issue is probably the single biggest symptom of climate change that people in the US are dealing with at the moment, as to say that's what is alerting most people to the fact that there is a crisis being generated here. It's when it starts to hit people's actual assets and bank accounts in that way that they start to recognise, oh shit.
Yeah. And it actually starts to have real impacts day to day. And one of the biggest drivers of inflation in New Zealand, but also internationally in the last 2 or 3 years, has been insurance premiums. And it's raising some interesting questions, for example, in Europe, where they're a bit more advanced in thinking about climate change and incorporating it in their financial frameworks. The European Central Bank is genuinely asking the question, should we have a different interest rate, and a particularly lower interest rate, for investments in decarbonisation and electrification? Because at the moment, the irony is that all of these insurance costs is pushing up inflation, which the central banks are reacting to by pushing up interest rates, which makes it more difficult to build all of the wind farms and solar farms and new lines that we've got. In fact, we got news this week out of the Commerce Commission that it wants to see lines charges for Transpower and the lines companies here to increase by 48% in the next 5 years. To help not just repair maintenance that wasn't prepared for in the past, but also to strengthen networks to deal with climate change, and also to deal with the extra electrification that's needed, so that when we all try to charge our electric cars at once, it doesn't go bang. Not to mention the issues with climate, just in where we are on an island last night, a very bad storm in Auckland. Our power was out for a couple of hours now. It came back on again, which is great. Otherwise, there'd be no Hoon. But these are really starting to cause issues around not just here, but around the world, and right now, in a way that
We'll have to
perhaps I
get
don't
you
think a lot of people.
a Starlink terminal and an uninterruptible power supply. I'm surprised
Well, that's
the other person in your
resilience
house
plan.
hasn't organised that yet.
Yes, no,
Battery, yeah.
I keep asking for that.
Actually, one of the interesting things in the budget this year is one of the new spending lines around climate was this package. I think it was labelled under adaptation, but the bulk of it was going towards repairing shit that got broken by Cyclone
Yes.
Gabrielle over the
Yes,
next few
yeah.
years. And you kind of think, is that really where most of our money is going? Because there's going to be more of those. I mean, if there's one thing we know about climate change, it's that the impacts are progressively getting worse. And so whatever happened last year or the year before, we can expect a lot more of that in the future. And yet we don't really see that understanding reflected in the budget numbers.
And it's about repair rather than adaptation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's not really a lot going into building our resilience, not nearly as much as we're going to need. You get a few of those one on top of the other. And, a lot of people, particularly regions, are going to be in some serious trouble trying to deal
Catherine,
with that.
just going back for a minute before you turn this into a budget conversation, and Bernard will turn it into a housing conversation. Looking at that Delhi situation, 52.9 degrees, I think it was, record temperature in Mexico. It's about 38, I think. What are the next sort of tipping points from a news point of view? What should be people? I mean, what's the weather forecast in Delhi, and what are the other sort of trigger points that we're looking at? Because if you're looking at a city as big as Mexico City with a critical water problem, new president, of course, but critical water problem, you've got elections going on in India as we speak. There's a pretty potentially rather volatile situations.
Well, the other big volatile thing that could be coming up is around, I think, food security, because obviously chaotic weather like has impacts on agriculture as well, and on agricultural output, which is also affected by things like conflicts, which are in turn affected by fighting over resources that we need for the transition. And, they're all kind of connected, but we're already in a situation where food security, the number of people that need intervention in terms of food from the UN and so on, has increased every year since 2019. We're up to about 282 million odd people last year that needed food aid. And that there's real worries that there's going to be, you get enough of these kind of chaotic climate weather scenarios happening, and you start to get a shortage of key food stocks globally. And that means the price of food goes up, obviously. But the people for whom food is the biggest part of their budget, of their weekly, monthly, daily budget, feel that the most strongly, and that's people in developing countries and in places like India. I mean, one of the things that you see with people today in that 53-degree heat is people saying, well, if I don't go to work, nobody's going to come and feed my kids. So they're having to go out and work in those kind of conditions just in order to keep,
At least
food
they
on
can
their
boil.
plates.
At least they can fry an egg on their own cars.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
they don't have to. They can have a cup of tea just by turning the tap on because the water's coming out of the tap's boiling.
Yeah,
Um,
we're
but you know,
we're going to
it's
some dark places here,
Yes,
people.
yeah.
And
But food security is the next, I
yeah,
think, potentially the next big one that's really going to hit hard. So yeah.
yeah, and just another data point in one of the other bits of work that I do, I look at the price of rice in Thailand and Vietnam. And one of the major reasons for inflation in Thailand and Vietnam in the last couple of months has been a surge in rice prices because of droughts and severe weather through the Southeast Asian rice bowls, if you like. And that is one of the sort of, I mean, if you look at things in a purely financial sense, if climate change doesn't get your attention because of the extreme weather events, just have a look at your household bills for food and insurance. It's
Yeah.
coming right through already.
Yep.
Catherine, it's early days on the budget, but was there anything in there that jumped out or maybe was missing?
I think it's the stuff that's missing that is the most worrying. It's that lack of investment in building resilience and adaptive capacity. It's the lack of investment in public transport and cycling networks and things like that. All of, because you know you're looking at a scenario where if the spending goes on roading and that gets more cars onto the road, then our emissions increase, and so we have more costs out the other end of that. So all of the things we've already been talking about over the last few months about what this government's plans are, that's still the same concerns as what we see in the budget, is just the lack of spending on the kind of things that are actually going to be what we need to see over the next few years to deal with it.
Yeah, one
and
of the
very
most
ideological
interesting.
to have them not there.
Yeah, it's, you know, even just like the storm from last night, you know, you just in Auckland, you're just seeing a lot more of that sort of thing that's quite damaging, and one way or another, you're going to pay for it. You know, it's going to be dealt with, but you know, we could be making things a lot easier on ourselves in the future by doing a bit more planning around that and a bit more resilience building.
One of the things I like to do when covering the budget is to start at the back and move forward. And it's a bit like any set of financial accounts. It's the interesting stuff is always in the notes. And one of the fun things about reading a budget is the fiscal risks section that Treasury writes, which hardly anyone ever looks at, but it can be quite eye-opening. And one of the fiscal risks identified in the Foreign Affairs budget, which is time-limited international climate financing funding, unfunded 2026 to 2030. The Treasury says that there is some money put aside for climate finance, although in the past that was coming from the Climate Emergency Response Fund, which has been pillaged for tax cuts. But here's what Treasury says about the period from beyond 2025. So 2026 to 2030, which is when we're supposed to meet our Paris Climate Agreement rules. Treasury says, while the timing and quantum of New Zealand's next international climate finance commitment for the period 2026 to 2030 are unknown, continuing the current commitment may require more than provided for in the fiscal forecasts. So there is a real issue developing there.
And that more sits in the billions, doesn't it? It doesn't sit in a couple of extra million. We're talking billions of dollars at stake here for that, aren't we?
The forecasts by the McGuinness Institute in their paper about it talks about a potential liability of over 10 billion, closer to 20 billion, depending on which carbon forecast you use. And that would be a very useful thing to put into the accounts, to just have some discipline, some fiscal discipline applied to governments
Yeah.
of both colours, so that they actually
We
have to
talked
work
about
to reduce that liability.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit last week about the idea of constructive obligations and how that ought to be appearing in the Treasury's balance sheet and kind of doesn't. You know, it's in the notes
Yeah.
at the back.
And unfortunately, they haven't included it in a formal sense today. Fantastic. Catherine, thank you so much for...
Just a second, Bernard. Let's just quickly ask Catherine a couple of questions from our audience, because they're very relevant and very sort of specific. Hi, Craig. I'm not meaning to distract you. But to read Harmless Solutions and Francisco Blaha ask about this question of stored domestic power and Starlink and so on. What are the thoughts about distributed generation, domestic batteries, and the possibility of using power to load from electric cars?
Yeah, I mean, that again requires a bit of infrastructure to be put in place to do it, right? But yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of distributed energy. I think it's much better from a resilience point of view, and a good way to build capacity as well. I mean, and at the moment, it's starting to look like, for a lot of places, there's companies out there now doing deals where you can get battery storage and solar panels put on your place, and it doesn't cost you more than what your power bill currently would cost you going into the future. Now, that seems like a really good bet when they're talking about increasing some of the pricing to the extent that they are. But I think, when you start to get a lot of uptake of that, that's going to present a whole lot more problems for the electricity system to try to adapt to.
Okay, thanks, Catherine.
So I don't know. Yeah.
And
Bernard, take it away.
unfortunately, there's not much. Thank you very much, Catherine. And there's not much
Thank you.
detail or spending or announcements in the budget along those lines. Welcome into the Hoon again to Craig Rennie from the CTU. Lovely to see you, Craig. A huge day for you. Another budget to ingest and to change your DNA. So, Craig, this is the budget part of the Hoon. So, what did you think of the budget?
It was a really interesting budget today. I mean, somebody asked me when I got back to work today, how bad was it on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, it certainly wasn't a Liz Truss, crack open the lettuce budget. The bond markets aren't about to collapse as a consequence of this budget. The Treasury does a very good job of managing that sort of thing. But it's right up there, in terms of, the risks that it presents and the changes that are being presented to overall spending. This is a budget that delivers what the government wants, not necessarily what the public needs. So it's chosen to put its own political survival up front in terms of tax cuts, and largely tax cuts that are paid for by borrowing, rather than delivering, there are real terms cuts to core education expenditure, to expenditure on ECE, on tertiary education. In March, the Ministry of Health was telling the Health Select Committee that the amount of money which is currently being earmarked for cost of living changes for health wasn't enough, but it's still in the budget. So, the number of people who will be benefited by the overall tax cuts, they've talked about 83% of New Zealanders benefiting from tax cuts, but the number of families who will be benefiting by the $250 mark, I would put it like this: there'll be a larger population of Foxton than there will be the number of people who benefit from the $250 a fortnight cuts. So overall, the package is there, but it's a package that's politics first, economics second.
Which reminds me, Craig, of one of the best headlines ever in the Manawatu Evening Standards: "Have a fun-filled day in Foxton." Craig, is there anything good? Is there anything good in the budget that you would work? I mean, it's important that we remind people that you're from the Council of Trade Unions and therefore have a certain potentially perspective. Is there anything good in it, in a sense that's like beneficial, as opposed to the political aspect?
Well, one of the things that's in there, first of all, it's always good to say it could be worse. There is ongoing funding for health education. There is money going in to new services in health. There are new doctors being trained as part of this package. There are some changes to working for families and tax credits that will help low-income households. On balance, however, it gives as much as it takes, because we have to remember that this package is on top of the package that was announced at the mini budget. So we're still losing free prescriptions. We're still losing half-price public transport. There's still a huge amount of money that's coming out of public services and out of government departments. And the best example I can give you of that is for Vote Māori Development and Vote Pacific Peoples, there's actually no new funding at all, full stop. There's no money. All there are cuts of approximately...
Well, there's a huge amount of funding for Te Matatini. We get the circuses, if not the bread.
Indeed, and in terms of Māori housing, there are cuts.
So just on the politics, Craig, the government says, yeah, we've given tax cuts, but they're fully funded with spending cuts and a few little bits and pieces of extra revenue there. This is not inflationary. But you said earlier that there was extra borrowing. So what's going on here?
So, very avid readers of the Budget, Economic and Fiscal Update 2024
me.
can highly recommend it. Nighttime reading. We'll turn to figure 2.15, which is this figure here.
Oh, cool. Don't worry, I'll be
Um,
putting it in the email. Yep.
and figure 2.15, net core crown debt compared to the half-year update. Net core crown debt is expected to be higher than the previous forecast by $17.1 billion. This cash shortfall is largely funded by the government's bond programme, which has increased by $12 billion over the forecast period when compared to the half-year update.
Oh, look, I don't think that can be true, Craig, because I've just been reading an email from David Seymour, personal email, telling me that this is all the result of Labour destroying the economy by dramatically expanding government spending and ruinous debt. And then he says the budget does not go as far as ACT would like, but it goes further than it would without ACT.
David can believe what he wants. The Treasury, however, which is the source of truth in this space, tells me that we're borrowing more money. The tax cuts cost somewhere in the order of $10 billion across the forecast period. If we weren't giving away $10 billion, we wouldn't need to borrow $12 billion of new bond issuance. We would have that money. So we're borrowing for those tax cuts. Those tax cuts are essentially going to be paid for by future taxpayers.
So on that economic front, can the government correctly say, well, the economy is worse than we expected, and that's why we had to borrow the money, but that's all Labour's fault? Is that right?
So Nicola Willis in opposition said there were 3 tests that she would give to the tax cut programme. It wouldn't require any borrowing, it wouldn't cause inflation, and 3, it could be delivered regardless of the state Labour left the books in. None of these things have fallen to be true. The Treasury's forecasting that the fiscal impulse will be positive next year. That's adding to aggregate demand. The tax package hasn't been the one that was delivered, that was proposed in opposition. Working for families tax changes aren't being delivered as promised, which actually benefits precisely the low and middle income earners that the now government promised to help during during the election. So it fails on all 3 of those tests. But most importantly, Bernard, both you and I, vaguely call ourselves economists, and we all remember the famous quote from J. Maynard Keynes: "When the facts change, so do my opinions." If the economic facts had changed so much, then you're allowed to change your opinions. In fact, not doing so is not very wise. If the government can't have it both ways, it can't say that the economic data is worse than we had predicted, but we're going to plough on with tax cuts regardless, because that's what we promised to do. You either do one or the other.
Craig, may I ask you a slight devil's advocate question in this, though? And I'll caveat this slightly by saying I was recently listening to the excellent Rest is Politics leading podcast with Kwasi Kwarteng, the former Chancellor, who lasted less than 2 weeks in the job.
So he wasn't so much a lettuce as
a microgreen.
Microgreen, that's right. Yeah.
And one of the things, of course, that he raised was, we need to go for growth. We need a radical, and there's absolutely no sense of personal responsibility on what happened in the UK. Is there an argument, though, that tax cuts do feed through to potential economic activity and growth? You've got interest deductibility on mortgages for rent for landlords in there. Surely this money is going to trickle down to the benefit of everybody in New Zealand, Craig.
If I had $1 for every time I'd heard the phrase "trickle down" benefiting everyone in New Zealand, I'd be marginally wealthier. But in terms of if you're going to do that, there are very well established ways of using tax changes and tax levers to really benefit the economy. So we can use that to encourage investment in the economy, to create great jobs in the economy. We can give it to very low income households because they spend every single dollar that comes through the door.
And but they don't vote national, Craig.
Well, they may not, but unfortunately, what the data also tells us in this report which is the child poverty report, is that on all three of the indicators, we're now heading in the wrong direction. And so if I could spend some money, tackle child poverty, deliver long-term beneficial change, and grow the economy at the same time, I would do. And I could do that if I tackled this. If I truly believed in social investment, I could do that, and I would do this. Instead, we're squeezing the money being spent on free school meals so that we can give $3 billion to landlords. If that doesn't tell you something about the state of the country, I don't know what does.
And the irony here is that the fiscal stimulus from the government in the coming year is slightly, than the previous government. Now, in the out years, it's less
Yes.
stimulus than the previous government, in fact, more of a contraction. And it's unlikely to, immediately force the Reserve Bank to do anything. But it's interesting to see some of the bank economists say it's still not great. And it's one of the reasons the Reserve Bank is keeping the official cash rate up for longer than we all thought, and probably well into next year. Craig, thank you so much for being on the show. It's lovely to
Thanks,
see
Craig.
you, and we'll be looking forward to talking to you again.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
Craig. Cheers. And it's time now to welcome into the show Max Rashbrook. Max, how are you?
I think Max
Well,
might have his
thank you, Bernard.
speakers
How are
turned
you?
on. Is that possible?
I think Max might have his speakers turned on.
No, I think this may be a Craig Rennie issue. Let me just see if I can fix that. I can remove Craig. It might help us. It hasn't helped us, I don't think. It's okay. My apologies, everyone. Let me just see if I can solve this at my end. No, I can't.
Max, do you happen to have your speakers on?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can definitely hear you through your headphones. But we were just
Great.
That's better. Thank you.
Great, and we seem to have lost the echo. Fantastic. Max, it is absolutely wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for coming onto the show after a football accident, which has, I hope you scored and you won with the header.
Yeah, it was a tackle that accidentally went south, but we won, and that's the main thing.
Oh, good. It's lovely to see you. And firstly, congratulations on the launch of a very interesting development in the political economy space, which is your new Idea Institute. Could you tell us about that first before we jump onto the budget again?
Yeah, sure. Look, so this is a think tank that I and some colleagues have just launched. It's called IDEA because it's short for the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis. And it's called that because it's going to work on two of the big issues that I've always been concerned about, that I'm really worried about, which is economic disparities and political disengagement, which I think both of them obviously, really hugely worrying negative forces in their own right. But I'm particularly worried about the way they combine, so all the people living in poverty who feel excluded because of that, so they're tuning out of the political system, and that just sets the stage for ever more inegalitarian policies. And so the think tank is going to try to work on that in the way that think tanks do, research the solutions, research the problems, develop solutions, and try and communicate that to the public and to policymakers.
And one of the problems we've had over the last 10 years or so, and you could argue since the demise or the winding in of the New Zealand initiative into what is now the New Zealand initiative, but more like the Business Roundtable. Why has it been so sort of tough for the want of a better phrase, centre-left, to have a think tank to offset some of the impact of not just the New Zealand initiative, but also the likes of the Taxpayers Union?
Well, look, I think there's New Zealand as a whole struggles with funding research and thinking. I think would be my sort of, I'd zoom out to that wider lens, and we've had a couple of responses to the think tank with people saying, look, this is great because just that whole infrastructure of thinking is not in a great way in New Zealand. And of course, some of that traditionally would have happened through a more seriously focused media, and we all know about the crisis there, although of course, people like you are trying to
We're
repair some of
totally
that
serious,
damage.
absolutely. Going on. Yeah.
Absolutely. And look, and also universities, it's well established and not in a good way, and are letting people go rather than hiring by and large. So I think there's just generally in New Zealand, there's been a long running lack of investment in thought and research and policy, which has just has been deteriorating in the last few years. And in whatever modest way, we're trying to plug some of that gap.
So now time to do the think tanky stuff and tell us what you thought of the budget.
Well, it's fascinating, right? I've just been reflecting in the last couple of hours about the fact that the Taxpayers Union are complaining about the fact that Willis is lining up big increases in spending, core crown spending going from about $123 billion last year to 140 something billion, in a couple of years' time. So they're saying, oh, they're just still spending all the money. Meantime, you've got people on the left claiming about, decrying cuts and sort of austerity and things like that. And how do you, what's the truth there? And I think the reality is it's not a slash and burn budget. There will be more billions of dollars more spent, in just sort of pure nominal terms. Spending as a proportion of the economy is only going to decline slowly to that sort of long run average of 30% by about 2033, I think. There are billions of extra dollars for health and education. So I don't think it's slash and burn. But it is, I think, at the same time, a little divorced from reality, because when you look at the spending increases, they're just stuff to keep the lights on, basically, and increases in New Zealand super. When you break down the health and health spending, 17 billion extra over 4 years, well, great, but most of that's just dealing with inflation and demographic change. The amount of money for actual new initiatives is minuscule and probably massively insufficient. Same story in education. So what it is, it's sort of a budget that prioritises short-term political needs, so tax cuts, while kind of closing its eyes to the reality of the massive spending increases we need to actually do something about health and
But Max,
education and tackle
isn't
poverty.
there an argument? Apparently, Tova O'Brien has described this as a beige budget, which seemed to me to be a slightly shallow way to see it. That it's actually much more of a blue budget aimed at historic. If people have more money in their pocket, particularly middle class to wealthy people, isn't that going to flow through to potentially greater economic growth, exactly as they're forecasting, or does it tend to get stuck on the side and be spent on trips to Oslo, where I am?
Well, look, I mean, there's no doubt that it's a very political budget that's aimed with laser-like precision at low to middle income, not poor families who have been cut out almost entirely, low to middle income working families with children. That's absolutely the focus. So some low-level tax cuts, childcare rebates, things like that. But no, I mean, I don't think that's going to. I mean, the forecasts for economic growth are pretty anemic. The forecasts for productivity are very, very poor. The Treasury's very worried about that. GDP per person is not going to recover really, for several years. There's no real sign of an amazing. I mean, the economy will pick up from where it is now, but there's no sign of a really strong revival, and I think that's because there's no investment. There's no investment in retraining.
Yeah.
There's no
evidence of an
investment.
industrial policy either, is there?
No industrial policy. No investment in the tens of thousands of people who are going to be put out of work. No investment in trying to help them, find work. No real big boost for R&D, for science, for higher education, even really for high school education or for ECE. I mean, the funding there is just keeping the lights on stuff, and no funding really at all to tackle poverty, which is something that costs the economy 1 to 3% of GDP every year. Just in terms of to service failure.
On that, Max, just to step back a bit with your big picture hat on, one of the underlying themes of the last at least a decade or so in fiscal policy discussion from both sides of Parliament, when I say both sides, National and Labour, is that it's a natural and good thing to try to get the size of the government below 30% of GDP. And this budget does include a forecast, depending on which measure of the crown you describe, that it does get eventually down below 30% of GDP. Now, this is said as, like, well, everyone believes that's true and good. But actually, is it? And one of the things that struck me about this budget was on page 37, a box from the Treasury talking about pressures on future budget operating allowances. And there's $2.4 billion set aside for the next 3 budget allowances, which is designed to deal with, the normal cost increases you get in health and education and various other bits and pieces. But it's interesting, Treasury has made this comment, and for me this is quite a strong thing for Treasury to say. Quote, the high-level analysis indicates that future budget allowances are unlikely to be sufficient to cover future cost pressures on existing services. This means any shortfall in spending on new initiatives will need to be offset by expenditure savings, reprioritisation or revenue-raising policy changes for each of the next 3 budgets. What they're essentially saying is, as you're suggesting, just the natural cost increases, there's inflation, but also health and education tend to grow faster than the economy as a whole. And therefore, if you're going to have a 30% limit on the size of government, you're permanently pressing down like a sinking lid, always having to ratchet it down, and stuff squirts out the sides, i.e. less services, slower operations, poorer education, more poverty. 30%, is that the right number for our economy?
No, I don't think it is, and I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head with this presumption that that is the right number. I mean, if you take just, I often talk about, 3 European countries for comparison. Germany typically spends more like 36%, the Netherlands about 38%, and Austria 40% of GDP, which if you applied those overall tax takes to the New Zealand economy, it works out as something in the ballpark of we'd have another $20 to $30 billion a year for public services if we taxed at those European rates. So we've made this decision to permanently keep spending at an artificial low level, just out of ideology. And because we're not willing to raise the taxes, it would get us up to those higher rates, and that would be things like wealth taxes and capital gains taxes, but probably also a lot more of sort of the payroll taxes that fund healthcare in other countries. So you've got that long-running problem. Then on top of that, you've got the fact that there's all these rising costs, and these are well worn by now, I think, but they include adapting to climate change. Billions and billions of dollars we'll have to spend there. And the health and, to some extent, superannuation costs of dealing with an aging population. I would also say the increasing costs caused by long-run poverty, all the costs that poor children pile up over their lifetime because their lives are so difficult. Basically, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep spending at 30% of GDP. We're trying to keep this, it's not a sinking lid, but it's sort of basically it's a flat lid, while these incredible pressures are pushing up underneath it. And that is just long-term unsustainable. So that's why I say, I think in this budget, the government sort of looks superficially a bit beige and responsible, but it's actually closing its eyes, closing its ears to the reality of of the spending that we need to make in future years.
And building up a liability in financial terms. Max, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and good luck.
Thanks,
with the Idea Institute. And for those who are looking to have a look around, the URL is ideainstitute, one word, .nz. Thank you so much to Max Rashbrook. Great to see you. Now we'd like to welcome into the show for the first time Chris Glodell, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of Community Housing Aotearoa, which is the peak body for New Zealand's community housing providers, who are now very much in the spotlight because the government has said after its Kāinga Ora review that it wants to do a lot more work with the community housing providers. Chris, welcome on to the Hoon.
Thank you for having me.
So, Chris, could you tell us, what's the mood out there at the moment amongst community housing providers with the announcements in recent weeks from the government?
I think the general mood is cautious optimism. It's great to see the 1,500 new social housing places being allocated and having the certainty that all 1,500 are going to go to community housing providers, and and um, and the fact that about 500 of those are going to get moving in the short run, because we know members have had projects sitting with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development when the prior allocation was used up, and so being able to continue those developments that already had significant expenditure to get to that stage is really good news for our members and for the thousands of households on the social housing register.
Could you just set the scene for us for social housing in Aotearoa? We've got Kāinga Ora as the biggest social housing provider on the block, obviously fully state owned, and we've got community housing providers. Could you give us a sense of the relative scales and the growths that's been happening?
Certainly, Kaingoora, as you said, is the largest provider and has been the largest landlord in New Zealand, for that matter, and I think around 70,000 social houses now. The community housing sector has been around for decades also, but not in a formalized sense in the same way as what occurred in 2014 when the prior national government created Capital Community Housing Provider as a regulated class of organizations that are registered with the regulatory authority. And since that time, they went from no social houses in the aspect that it's now called, which is related to those homes that receive the income related rent subsidy and who take households from the social housing register, which is maintained by the Ministry of Social Development. So, since 2014, to now, I think we're around 12,000 social homes. And overall, our members own, manage somewhere around 19,000. And there are many other organizations that don't fall into that classification of a registered community housing provider. You have many other faith-based groups, other community housing organizations that just serve different populations. And you have Maori providers and iwi who have long provided various forms of housing, Papakainga, Kamatua housing, that don't necessarily fit into that definition and have thousands of additional homes.
And Chris,
then
what's the virtue?
sorry.
Sorry, if it's for me, Peter. What's
No.
the virtue of delivering social housing through organisations like yours, and what regime do you need? I mean, I'm thinking, having lived a long time in the UK, historically you've had the Peabody Trust and Roundtree, some of these great historic Quaker based organisations have been huge providers of public housing or social housing, and today you've got many much more sort of not exactly neighbourhood based but sort of regionally based community housing providers. What's the virtue of using your members rather than Kainga?
We've never looked at it as a rather. It's an and. We still need strong state housing provision, and our members have been very consistent with that message. But we also think that it's good to have a mix of options, and that community providers, as you mentioned, often have a long history within communities, have a social purpose that goes beyond just housing, and those connections locally and understanding of local conditions, other services and supports that are available, and the needs of their community in a way that often gets lost through national organizations and through the bureaucracies of government.
So the man behind the Kāinga Ora report that's just come out, Bill English, was really the architect of the moves between 2014 or so and 2017 to open up the government's funding streams, so that's income-related rent subsidies and some capital grants to community housing providers, and there was action there. But the Labour government really focused all its attention and capital and revenue support on Kāinga Ora. One of the worries that Labour had was that there aren't enough big balance sheets in the community housing providers sector to be able to move the dial fast enough and big enough to get a lot more social houses out there. Is that right?
Certainly, community housing providers do have smaller balance sheets, but that's also a factor of where they've been and the government policy choices and settings that were in place. And so some of the larger providers that you see active today are those that did benefit from prior government capital grant programs, the Housing Innovation Fund that began in the early 2000s, followed by the Social Housing Fund that provided up to a 50% grant. And so they were able to start on that journey. And Peter, you mentioned the housing associations in the UK, and they benefited from the transfer of stock from local authorities at basically no consideration. And we've seen similar activities in Australia, where those balance sheets were created, and now they're able to be self-sustaining in large measure. They're able to access private debt markets, issuing bonds. Our chief executive was just in the UK meeting with Piers Williamson with the Housing Finance Corporation, and they regularly issue, €1 billion denominated bonds at very low interest rates. But that's, 30, 40 years after those original transfers were made. And so it does take time to build those balance sheets.
Just finally, Chris, the government has offered 1,500 places, social housing spots for the community housing sector. And my reading of the budget suggests there's not much extra at the moment for either Kāinga Ora or the community housing providers. How much of a task do we have? Is 1,500 going to cut it?
Well, when you look at the goals that the government has set to reduce the reliance on emergency housing hotels by 75% over 2 years, the 1,500 that are allocated only begin from July of 2025. But there are those 3,000 in the pipeline already from last year's budget. So, it will help on that. But I think as the previous speaker was talking about, there's a lot of pent up pressures. Families are doing it hard. We continue to see the impacts of inflation and rising costs on households. So we don't see demand diminishing in the short run. And so I think we're going to have to see additional augmentation to be able to really turn the dial on housing. We think we've been behind billions of dollars in investment for decades. And as you well know, housing is expensive, land is expensive, and there's no easy way out of this. I was heartened when I heard Minister Bishop speaking several months ago and talking about a long-term goal to get the median multiple, the median income to median house prices in the 5 to 7 range. The first time I've heard a housing minister talk about that. It's still in the upper end of unaffordability, but it's starting to set a marker and something that can be measured. And we support that, and we think we really need to adopt a national housing strategy that all parties would buy into, so that we can set some of these foundational aspects of what we want our housing market to look like, and the tenures and the supports that we'll put in place to ensure that we get the outcomes that we want to see.
Chris, thank you very much for coming on to the Hoon. Lovely to hear you, and good luck. Chris Glodell there, the Deputy Chief Executive of Community Housing Aotearoa. And we're into the final part of the show, and really we haven't spoken much about the rest of the world.
No, well, it is that kind of week, isn't it? Well, I was also going to say we've had a lot of good feedback on the YouTube to Max's comments and Craig Rennie, and of course Tim Barlow's picked up a line that I think was from Max, talking about 1 to 3% of GDP to service failure, or was that Craig? And I think that is a really interesting idea, that there's something sort of static and unimaginative about it. And then of course you've just had your housing session, and that News Hub story this week about the texts between Chris Bishop and Bill English saying, "Oh mate, we need to take a look at Kāinga Ora, but for Christ's sake, don't talk to them. We'll just, it'll be independent. Yeah. That's not terribly independent, I thought. And what did you make of Kāinga Ora's board response to this? Because I just thought the bashing of Kāinga Ora, both politically and I would argue in the New Zealand Herald, has been pretty extraordinary. Which it may deserve to be bashed, but it had its response the other day. What's happened there, Bernard?
Yeah, and I've included in the email I put out on Tuesday the full response from Kāinga Ora, which was released under the Official Information Act a few days ago and has been reported on partly by the New Zealand Herald, but also Newsroom has done a good report on it. It was a very measured and precise dismantling of the report from on Kāinga Ora from Bill English, which essentially said they didn't talk to us much. A lot of the accusations are actually based on anecdotes. Some of it was wrong and went uncorrected, and effectively challenged this idea that Kāinga Ora is financially unsustainable. I commented in a RNZ episode of The Detail that when you look at Kāinga Ora's financial performance in a traditional sense of, like a household or a company, the growth in the value of Kāinga
their
Ora's
underlying assets.
The land and the houses has far outpaced the growth in its debt. And when you look at its current position in terms of debt to assets, its loan to value ratio is far, far below anything that a household would think is a problem. And also, if you looked at it in a purely net worth sense for the government over the last decade, Kāinga Ora has added more to the measured net worth of the government of New Zealand than any other action, simply by owning residential land. Now, you could argue, well, that's not Kāinga Ora's good work. That's just plain old luck,
Land
or
bank.
or plain old New Zealand entitlement to tax-free capital gains. One of the frustrating things for a lot of people about Kāinga Ora is they can't get access to those tax-free capital gains because they're captured by Kāinga Ora, and they want to get their hands on it. And you know what? It's been the biggest free kick in the history of New Zealand finance. Getting hold of land, however legitimately, holding on to it, capturing the value, not paying tax on it, and sitting back and rubbing your hands. And frankly, there's a lot of people look at some of that Kāinga Ora land in Auckland and in various other places and go, that should have mansions on it. I should be capturing that capital gain, not the government.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, why should
It's a
we
blue
be paying
budget.
to build?
That's a blue budget.
Blue budget, yeah.
So, Bernard, let's just have a quick whiz around international things. I have been really struck. I think we talked about this possibly last week. And it's a joke in a sense, saying Israel isolates world, but you've had two developments this week. The developments going on right now, which is this Israel creating a buffer strip on the Egyptian border with Gaza, that is going to throw the relationship with the long-standing relationship with Egypt, which cost President Sadat's life. That's a really dangerous escalation in this, and it presumably means, as we're seeing tanks move into Rafah, that the Biden red line about a full-on attack in Rafah is being crossed, despite 8 months of Biden sacrificing his own political outlook for Bibi Netanyahu.
So Bibi is calling bullshit on Biden.
That's right. And then there's this extraordinary story this week, which we've talked a couple of times about previous investigations by an Israeli, and it's all in The Guardian too, but an Israeli investigative journalism organization called 972, which has come up with this absolutely remarkable set of quotes and information about Mossad. And the head of Mossad is the former head of national security to Netanyahu. And it's a series of exposés which show that he threatened the former head of the International Criminal Court in a way that could only be seen as a mafia type assault, and said to her, quote, "You should help us and let us take care of you. You don't want to be getting into things that could compromise your security or that of your family." I mean, it's really, it'd be a shame, nice international court you've got here. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. And I think these things are really, this isolation of Israel under Netanyahu and in this process is pretty extraordinary. And I've been thinking a lot about it this week, talking to people about, in particularly where I used to live in North London, about what it is to be Jewish in North London and London at the moment. I have friends who have, in fact, more or less moved to Israel because they say they feel safer there, or that it's less provocative. But talking to other people, they're calling bullshit on this idea that everything in this is a is an attack on Israel and is therefore anti-Semitic. And I think there's some very serious reckoning here, and some very the blowing of decades of goodwill towards Israel in a 7-month period is reminiscent, of course, on what happened to the US with the invasion of Iraq after 9/11. Is that it sort of pissed away an extraordinary outpouring of goodwill. So I think we're in a very critical, well, a super critical phase right now.
And just to end the show on a more humorous note, which we try to do.
It's a doozy. It's a doozy, as we say in the profession. Yeah.
This is our skateboarding dog for today, and it's one of those ones involving Zoom, in which a judge in the United States was having a hearing with someone in which the person was being accused of not having a driver's license. And I'll put the link in the
Driving without a driving license.
driving without a driver's license. Driving without a driver's license. And I'll put the link to the video that's there. Suffice to say that the video shows the man accused of driving without a driver's license, and doing a Zoom call with the judge at the same time, which that's some sort of
He's
that's
got
some sort
testicles,
of
that person.
Zoom
I quite like
madness.
that.
Yeah. He wasn't on mute either.
And Bernard, also on international news, I hope you like the fact that I've let my hair go all Geert Wilders.
I was going to Geert Wilders. Oh dear. How very European.
He looks like Margaret Thatcher in drag. Yeah.
Yeah. Peter, lovely to see you. Thank you very much.
Lovely to
We're
see you
looking
too.
forward to having you back.
Oh,
soon.
by the way, I had a delicious reindeer steak the other day. It was bloody good. We should start growing reindeer in New Zealand, and they're delicious. We could change our whole export.
We do make and sell venison, but it's for
Yeah.
big prices at the moment.
Reindeer's a whole different thing, and their little red noses are scrumptious.
Oh, that's enough. That's enough. Ka kite anō, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us a little bit longer. That has been the Hoon on the Kaka.
Thank
I'm
you.
Bernard Hickey and Peter Bale. We'll catch you all again next week at 5 o'clock. Ka kite anō.